Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. For this video, I wanted to do a follow-up on one of the recent heavy metallurgy streams that I did with Marty, Melanie from Melanie Loves Death Metal, and also with Eric Bauer from High Defamation TV. Recently, we did one of our Friday night streams talking about our 10 favorite heavy bands of all time. It was a really fun stream. Folks had a good time. Chat was very engaged with it, had lots of good bands that got mentioned and highlighted. What I wanted to do for this video, though, was talk about a few of the bands that I didn't include on my top 10. We had time set aside for honorable mentions, which we did. I only mentioned two because we did honorable mentions at the start of the video. I did not know how long the stream was going to run. We already knew that Eric was running a little late that night. And so I kept my honorable mentions very short. I only mentioned two of them because I was a little worried that, it could end up becoming like a 4-hour stream. And it'd been a very long week. That wasn't something I could really do that night. So I'm like, let's keep this, short and to the point and get on to the top 10. But there were some other bands that people also asked about later in the chat. Like, hey, you haven't talked about this band yet. And I'm not going to because they didn't make the list. So tonight I want to highlight a few more of the honorable mentions, bands that didn't quite make the cut, and I didn't get a chance to discuss why they missed the cut. Now, again, this was just our favorite bands. We each picked our top 10 favorite heavy bands of all time, whether it was metal, punk, hardcore, industrial, whatever. And just our favorites. No claims that they are the most musically talented or that the most influential bands to ever exist. Those would be different lists. These are just, the 10 bands we kind of personally each liked the most. People approached it different ways, and that's absolutely fine. Something that's very important to remember with this topic is that it's hard to whittle it down to a list of 10. Even Marty and Melanie at the start of the video were like, oh, I've just got like 20 or 30 here. It's like, no. We're supposed to make this hard and cut it down to 10. That was kind of the point, is that, yeah, it's a very tough thing to do. For a lot of heavy metal fans, we tend to like lots of bands. We tend to love lots of bands. And so when you have to sit down and really list only 10, it gets very tough. So hard choices have to be made, and people approached that in very different fashions. For me, I wanted bands that have a very long catalog, have a lot of great albums, a lot of consistency over time. Those are things that are important for me when I'm thinking about who are my most favorite bands. For example, a band like Crucifixion from the new wave of British heavy metal, I love everything they did. They released 7 songs. 8 if you include the re-recorded version of the Fox. Most other bands make one album with more than 8 songs on it. Crucifixion did 8 songs for their entire, vinyl career. Me personally, I'm not going to put a band like Crucifixion and list them as one of my favorite bands of all time because there's so little material there. That band is never going to make the cut against a band like Savatage or Kirith Ungol or Manowar, who have made multiple A-plus level albums. Having 8 killer songs is great, but they have to compete with bands that may have 8 killer records. On a list of top 10, there's just not room for a band like Crucifixion. At least that's the way I see it. Other people may approach it differently, and that's quite all right. So let's talk about, I pulled 5 others that I had as potential honorable mentions. Didn't discuss that night, so let's go over them. The first one that did not make my list was Atlantean Codex. As much as I love this band, the problem with Atlantean Codex is simple. They're a newer band. They released their first EP in 2005, which means they're going on 20 years now, so they're not really that new. But they've only released 3 full-length albums, the 1 EP and a bunch of live recordings. And so again, that's simply not enough material to compete with bands like Blind Guardian or bands like Running Wild or Judas Priest or Black Sabbath. I think all 3 Atlantean Codex albums are A-plus, superb, top-notch material. This is a band that if they last another decade or two, crank out, half a dozen more albums, they will quite easily become one of my, yeah, top 5 or 3 favorite bands of all time. But they simply don't have a long enough track record to compete against these other bands. Atlantic Codex has 3 A+ records. Some of the bands in my top 10 have like 6 or 7 A+ records. So, excellent band. Still my favorite band of the 21st century. They just need a longer discography to get on this kind of list. All right. Another band that's one of my all-time favorites, but can't quite get onto a top 10 list like this, is Australia's Armored Angel. And this is a band that, I made a video on their discography very early on. I played a very limited role in helping them get interviewed for Metal Maniacs back in the early 2000s. Yeah, I ordered merchandise directly from them, directly from Australia, many times over the years. Love everything the band did. But this is another case where the band simply didn't release or record a whole lot. They have a handful of demos, which are excellent. They have, this one full-length album that came out kind of late in their career after the classic lineup had already kind of been, shuffled around. And that was about it. So even though I love the band to death, I, collect as much of their stuff as I can come across for a reasonable price. They just don't have a big enough catalog to compete with these legacy bands that have been around making top-notch records decade after decade after decade. So Armored Angel, definitely sort of an honorable mention for me. I just didn't have time to go over it on the stream. All right, let's get to a few maybe heavyweight bands that could have been in the conversation. And I think all 3 of these bands were mentioned by at least one of the other guests that night as making their top 10 list, but they didn't make my list. The first one that we need to talk about, we have to address the finger-pointing demon in the room. Where was Merciful Fate on my list? They are not on my list. The deal for me with Merciful Fate is their original run of material. The first EP and the 2 albums are some of the finest heavy metal ever made. Don't Break the Oath could be in the conversation for top 25 albums of all time. But that's all they did until, they came back many years later and did albums in the 90s. And some of the 90s albums are quite good. I like the first couple they did, In the Shadows and Time. But with each subsequent album after that, they kind of got a bit mediocre. This was when King Diamond was trying to juggle both the Merciful Fate lineup and, his own band's lineup. And as we've covered on other heavy metallurgy streams in the past, some of those albums by the mid and late 90s start to feel a little cookie cutter, just not quite on the same level. So what you're looking at is, from the way I'm approaching this topic of favorite bands, 2 amazing albums and an amazing EP, and then a handful of albums, 5, 6 or so, that range from quite good to a bit disappointing. That just doesn't stack up against someone like Black Sabbath's catalog or Judas Priest's catalog. It just doesn't. Even though this album might be better than any individual Black Sabbath or Judas Priest album, I don't know. We'll have to wait till the time we do 10 favorite heavy metal albums of all time to figure out where this fits in with that. So even though this album might rank very high, Melissa could rank pretty high, as a whole, the catalog just doesn't have enough material and enough really top-notch material to compete with the bands in the top 10. Again, thinking about the bar here, number 10 on my list was Manowar. Looking at the Manowar discography, I see about 6 high-level albums. Things would be like 8.5, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 type albums. 6 of them. Merciful Fate only has 6 or 8 albums in the entire catalog? And some of those are things like Dead Again. Albums from later in the career that I can kind of take them or leave them. So no, Merciful Fate just doesn't make the cut here. All right, another one. I believe Marty had this band on his list. Manila Road. Not on my list. I did go through their catalog very carefully to consider them when thinking about this topic. It was a hard topic to come up with a list for. Manila Road certainly has the long discography. Now, this is where we get a little different. This isn't a band that just put out 2 albums or 5 albums. Manila Road had one of the longest discographies I looked at, with about 18 full-length studio albums. So yeah, they've got the pedigree there, and they obviously had some excellent material. The reason Manila Road didn't make my list is that for me, Manila Road is a band that burned very bright, but for kind of a short period of time. And after that, things got a bit uneven. I like the original Invasion EP, mini album, whatever you want to call it. I like the metal album just fine. And then they had 2 albums that are brilliant. Open the Gates, Crystal Logic. Again, those are things like Don't Break the Oath. They're in the conversation whenever I have to come up with my top 10 albums of all time. What do they have after that? Deluge, very good album. It's maybe a step down from those 2. Other people would argue that, hey, that's fine. But yeah, it's up there as well. After the Deluge, the Manila Road catalog gets a little dicey for me. While there's a lot of good albums, I don't like the thrashy leaning that they started to develop after that, and kind of carried over the next couple of albums a bit. Those late 80s albums like Courts of Chaos and stuff, I can do without those. There's some decent songs on them. One of them has, of course, some horrible synth sounds. Then there's Circus Maximus. Less said about that, the better. Into the Abyss, cool idea. Way too thrashy. I don't like Manila Road's thrashy phase. And when they come back, they have some good albums in the comeback catalog. They also have a lot of albums that just kind of felt like good, but not great. So in terms of Manila Road, there's like, 2 or 3 albums I consider very top shelf. And then there's a huge number of albums that I consider like average to good. This one's decent. That one's quite good. This one's pretty good. But there's only really the 2 albums that I would have as like A+++ kind of stuff. And a lot of the catalog is kind of, in that middle ground somewhere. There's only 2 or 3 albums I don't like. Now, don't get me wrong. It's a very solid, very consistent catalog overall. I like the band quite a bit. But again, number 10 on my list, Manowar, had 6 albums I'd list as top shelf. Manila Road, if I stretch it, I might make a case for 4 top shelf albums, probably only 3. So they're way behind the 10th place in terms of just, my personal favorite material. So Manila Road just didn't make my list. All right, 5th and last one to touch upon. Iron Maiden was not on my list. And this one seems very strange because Sabbath was there, Priest was there. I'm not going to go through all my rankings. If you haven't watched the stream, go check it out. Again, it's a really fun topic. Everyone had really cool lists. Iron Maiden, if I had named 3 honorable mentions during the stream, this would have been the 3rd one I mentioned. So they really were just on the cusp of things. How can I overlook Iron Maiden among favorite bands? Well, here's the numbers I came up with on Iron Maiden. They've got 17 studio full-length albums. There's about 5 of them I consider, again, really high quality, top shelf, grade A material. They're all in the first 7. I'd be looking at the self-titled, Killers, not Number of the Beast. That one's okay, but I have issues with that album. Peace of Mind, Seventh Son, and I can go back and forth on Power Slave sometimes, but I'll give you Power Slave. Okay, so 5 of the first 7, great stuff. Number of the Beast, overall I like it, but it does have some issues. Somewhere in Time, I famously am just not a huge fan of. Sue me. People didn't like that album a long time ago, and nowadays everybody seems to love it. That's cool, but never has clicked with me. So yeah, they have an amazing run through those first 7 albums. The problem is what happens after that. Seventh Son comes out, 87-ish? And then by the time you start, late 80s, No Prayer for the Dying. And from No Prayer for the Dying all the way up to now, and that's a span of 35 years or so, there's not any of those albums that I would have as like top shelf material. There's just not. There's a lot of albums there that I, again, having like the this one's good. This one's very good. This one's all right. This one is, disappointing. There's not many albums I dislike. I only counted about 3 that I would give a flat out thumbs down to. And all the others are there somewhere kind of in between. So Maiden has a little bit of the Manila Road problem where they peaked very early for me. And a lot of the later stuff, while, somewhere between acceptable to, really good, like, I like Dance of Death a lot. I like some of the stuff on Fear of the Dark a lot. Brave New World is a cool album. But they're not, top, notch all-time personal favorite albums either. And so Iron Maiden kind of just doesn't have the same longevity for me in terms of being a favorite band. If you told me today, Alan, you never get to hear another Iron Maiden song or album recorded after Seventh Son, I can live with that. I'll miss a few songs, Afraid to Shoot Strangers, Fear of the Dark, and I'd like to play Dance of Death a few more times here and there, but I won't lose a whole lot of sleep if you just end Iron Maiden's catalog at Seventh Son. That's just my take on it. I know there's a ton of people who enjoy their newer stuff, and that's very cool. For me, it just recent albums, some of them are okay, but I never listen to them. They're just not for me. And so again, compare this to like Judas Priest. I think they're the obvious one that always draws comparisons with Iron Maiden. How did the Judas Priest catalog stack up for me? Well, let's take a look. I've got some numbers over here. Priest, 18 studio full lengths. So yeah, very good comparison there. But I had about 5 albums that I considered pretty top notch, A+ material. Again, similar to Maiden's, 5 and 5. 9 albums kind of in between. So the numbers are very similar. The difference with Priests is that their great albums for me are a bit more spaced out through their career. They've got great ones early, like Sad Wings of Destiny. They've got great ones in the middle of their career when you get into things like British Steel, Defenders of the Faith. They have great ones getting a little later in the career. Painkiller, I like quite a bit. Firepower is not quite on that same level, but Firepower is still a pretty solid album. It gets a very strong thumbs up from me. And that's something I can't really say about any Iron Maiden album since Dance of Death. So Priest has had some bumps in the road too. I think, again, like Maiden, there's about 3, maybe 4 albums that I would say, like, nah, take a pass on this. I really don't need to hear Jugulator again. But the bumps are kind of scattered out more in the Priest catalog. So in my mind, at least, Priest has been a lot more consistent of a band over time. They've hit those, they kind of rang the bell about the same number of times, but they spaced it out more. It wasn't like Iron Maiden, where after 1987, they never quite got to that same peak again. That's why Priest was in my top 10. And that's why Iron Maiden didn't make my top 10. This may be a bit unfair. Maybe I'm just in a bit of a Maiden slump. Maybe the next time I take out some of those albums like Matter of Life and Death, they really start to click and ring home for me. And then in a couple of years, maybe I have to revise the top 10 and make room for Iron Maiden. As it stands right now, I guess that means Manowar gets bumped out since they're at number 10. We'll see how it plays out in the future. There's a new Sabotage album due out within the next year or so, if the band stays on schedule. Maybe that's great and they move up. Maybe it's another disappointment and I finally just say, screw this, and Sabotage falls out. And Eddie, you're up. Congratulations. Slide into the top 10. Leaving Maiden out is tough because I do love all that early stuff quite a bit. And, that was a big sort of formative part of my early metal years. Yeah, but again, they just kind of, they plateaued, stepped down a bit, and just never have gotten those peaks again. But that is just my opinion. So those are some of my other honorable mentions, bands that didn't make the cut and that got left out of the conversation on my part for the top 10 favorite heavy bands of all time topic. So now let's talk metal in the comments down below. A lot of people during the chat listed their top 10 favorite bands, and there were some very cool lists. If you didn't share during the chat, here's your chance. What are your top 10? And again, limit yourself to just 10. Think it over. It was interesting that as the stream was going on, I think the first time somebody mentioned Iron Maiden, there were several hardcore folks in the chat who were immediately like, Oh, crap. I forgot Maiden when I typed out my list earlier. And the knee-jerk response is, how do you forget Iron Maiden? Well, when you're trying to think through all the hundreds of bands that you've listened to during your life, you can overlook some big ones. So, yeah, type out your own top 10 list if you dare in the comments down below, but understand it's not the easiest task to do. And, hey, is there's one of these bands in particular that I've mentioned that I should work in? Should Manila Road have gotten forced in one way or the other? Should it have been Iron Maiden? Did Merciful Fate deserve a top 10 spot, even though the catalog's a little shorter than the others? Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. It's always fun to read what folks have on their mind. But that is going to do it for this one. So until next time, everybody take care. And as always, keep banging your head.